There are mornings that break you before breakfast. This was one of them. Victoria Sterling stood at the center of Velocity Dynamics Motors' production floor. 30 years old, 6 months into the CEO chair her father left her. Watching a man walk through the main entrance 47 minutes late on the single most important day in the company's history. $300 million. 12 executives from Hartwell International sitting upstairs in the glass conference room. And this man, grease-stained jacket, dark circles carved under his eyes like someone had pressed thumbs into his face, was strolling in like he hadn't just handed her a disaster. She didn't let him get 3 steps past the door. If what you're about to read makes your chest tight, you're already in it. Stay until the end, like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The production floor at Velocity Dynamics Motors smelled like metal and ambition. Hydraulic fluid, rubber seals, the particular chemical bite of fresh paint baking under the industrial lights. It was a smell Ethan Cross had known for 9 years. He'd walked through those doors as a 23-year-old with a community college certificate, $200 in his checking account, and a daughter who'd just turned 4. He'd worked his way from floor sweeper to senior diagnostic technician without anyone handing him a single thing. He knew every machine on that floor by sound. He could tell you which compressor had a loose bearing by the pitch of its hum at idle. He could diagnose a transmission fault by feel before the scanner confirmed it. He loved this building, even when the building didn't love him back. But walking through the entrance at 8:47 in the morning, 47 minutes late, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his hands scrubbed raw but not entirely clean, he could feel the temperature of the room change the moment he stepped inside. Every head turned. The floor had been buzzing with controlled chaos all morning. The Hartwell International Partnership Review was happening upstairs, and the entire plant had been told weeks in advance that today was a showcase day. Best work forward, no errors, no delays. He knew that. He'd marked it in his phone 3 times. He'd set 2 alarms. None of it mattered, because at 11:34 the night before, a call had come in that changed everything about the next 7 hours of his life. He saw Victoria Sterling before she saw him, or rather, before she turned to face him with that particular kind of stillness that meant she'd already made a decision and was just waiting for him to arrive so she could execute it. She was standing near the floor supervisor's station, tablet in hand, in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. She had her father's jaw, that same sharp line that Richard Sterling used to set whenever something on the floor wasn't working right. But the eyes were different. Richard's eyes were patient, even when he was furious. They waited. Victoria's eyes did not wait. She looked at Ethan, then at the clock mounted high on the wall above the bay doors, then back at Ethan. The floor got quiet. Not completely. Machines don't stop for drama. But the humans did. Tool sounds slowed. Voices dropped. Ethan counted maybe 20 technicians within earshot, all of them suddenly finding reasons to stay very still. He crossed the floor toward her. He didn't rush. Running would have made it worse. "Mr. Cross, her voice was flat, controlled. "It is 8:47. "I know." He stopped in front of her. "I can explain what Hartwell International has been in that conference room since 7:30. She glanced at the tablet in her hand, then set it face down on the supervisor's station. The way people set things down when they're done with them. Your diagnostic team was supposed to have the full vehicle presentation ready for review at 8. I had to send Marcus in your place. Marcus, who has been here 4 months and still confuses left-hand thread bolts with standard. I understand. If you give me 2 minutes, your attendance record already has 2 late arrivals this quarter." She reached toward the tablet again, didn't pick it up. "I have been extremely clear about the expectations for today. This is not a small morning. This is a $300 million morning. Ms. Sterling, please remove your badge and leave it with HR before you go." The floor stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan stood there for a moment. He was 32 years old, and he'd been exhausted before. Genuinely hollowed out tired, but the kind of tired he was right now was different. It had a name, and the name was unfair. And he'd learned a long time ago that unfair and life were not mutually exclusive concepts. He'd learned that when Sophie's mother left. He'd learned it again every time he sat at a kitchen table trying to explain to a 13-year-old girl why money was tight, and the answer wasn't, "It'll get better, but we'll figure it out." He didn't argue. Not because he had nothing to say, He had plenty. But because he could see in her face that the decision was already filed and signed, and there was no appeals process available on this floor, in this moment, with those 20 technicians holding their breath, he unclipped his badge. He held it for just a second, looking at the small worn photo on the front. 9 years of a face, a little younger, a little less tired. Then he set it on the supervisor's station next to her tablet. "Okay," he said. Just that. He turned and walked back toward his workbench. He kept his pace steady. His bench was near the east wall. A long steel surface he'd spent years organizing exactly the way his brain worked, with the diagnostic tools on the left in order of frequency of use, the specialty equipment on the right, and in the middle, a clear workspace that he kept genuinely clear, not staged clear, because he'd always believed that a cluttered bench was a distracted technician. He pulled open the lower cabinet drawer. He took out the thing he'd brought in that morning wrapped in a shop rag, and he carried it back across the floor. Victoria hadn't moved. He set it on the desk in front of her. The shop rag fell away when it landed, and what it revealed was a component, roughly 8 inches across, roughly cylindrical in shape, part of a fuel injection rail assembly. Or it had been. The metal was scorched on one side, the kind of scorching that happens when heat hits a surface that was never designed to get that hot. The plastic coupling at one end was partially melted. There were tool marks on the housing that didn't match any standard service procedure. Victoria looked at it. "That's from your father's Ferrari," Ethan said. "The 308 he kept in the private bay. I pulled it at 11:30 last night because I was running the quarterly diagnostic on all the stored vehicles. That's on my schedule, Ms. Sterling. It's been on my schedule for 6 weeks. And when I ran the injector sequence on that car, the pressure readings were wrong. Not a little wrong. Wrong in a way that was going to become a fire. Maybe not today, maybe not this week. But someone was going to take that car out and the engine bay was going to become a problem." She was still looking at the component. Something in her face had shifted, but she wasn't saying anything yet. "I spent the night replacing the rail assembly and running full diagnostic cycles to make sure the fix held," Ethan continued. "I didn't leave that bay until 6:15 this morning. I went home to change and I drove here, and there was an accident on Meridian that had both lanes closed. I have photos of the backed up traffic if you want to see them. I have the diagnostic logs from last night time-stamped from 11:42 to 06:10. I have all of it. I tried to explain that 2 minutes ago." Victoria finally looked up from the component. Something had moved behind her eyes, something she was working to control and doing a decent job of it, but not a perfect one. Her jaw was set tight. Her hand, which had been resting on the edge of the desk, had curled in slightly. "You should have called," she said. Her voice was quieter now, not softer, quieter. "I did. I called the floor supervisor at midnight. He told me to log it in the maintenance notes and deal with it in the morning. I told him I couldn't leave it until morning. He said to use my judgment." Ethan paused. "I used my judgment." There was a long moment. "The Ferrari was my father's," Victoria said. It came out like something she hadn't intended to say out loud. "I know." Ethan looked at her directly. "That's why I didn't leave." He didn't say anything else. He walked out. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he started the engine. He called his daughter. Sophie picked up on the second ring, the way she always did when she recognized his number, like she'd been waiting even when she hadn't. "Dad, why are you calling? It's a school day." "I know, He stopped, looked out the windshield at the Velocity Dynamics building, at the angular steel and glass facade that had represented a paycheck and something like pride for almost a decade. Something happened at work. A pause. Sophie was 13 and smarter than most adults Ethan knew, and she'd inherited whatever gene made a person read silence accurately. Bad something? Yeah. How bad? He thought about how to answer that. The mortgage, the utilities, Sophie's school supplies, the transmission service on the truck he'd been putting off for 2 months. He thought about all the numbers he kept in his head the way other people keep grocery lists. "We'll figure it out," he said. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you need me to not buy lunch today?" He closed his eyes. "No, babe, I got it. Have lunch." "Dad, I'll explain tonight. Go to class." He drove home. The house was small, Not apologetically small, just accurately small. A two-bedroom on Caldwell Street that Ethan had rented for 6 years. Long enough that he'd stopped noticing which floorboards creaked and which drawer in the kitchen needed to be lifted slightly to close properly. Sophie had decorated her half of the living room bookshelves with a combination of fantasy novels, automotive repair manuals she'd borrowed from Ethan and never returned, and a small framed photo of herself at age 8, sitting in the driver's seat of a vintage Mustang at a car show, grinning the kind of grin that suggested she was already planning to drive it. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He pulled up his employment records, the login he'd been using for 9 years. He navigated to the overtime section. He went to the previous night's logs. Nothing was there. He refreshed, typed the date again, searched by his employee ID. The hours from 11 p.m. to 6:10 a.m. simply did not exist in the system. Not disputed, not flagged, gone. He sat back in his chair and looked at the empty screen for a long time. He'd logged in at 11:42 p.m. He remembered it clearly because the system had been slow and he'd had to try twice. He'd recorded the initial diagnostic findings, flagged the pressure anomaly, noted that he was beginning component replacement. He'd updated the log 3 more times through the night. At 6:07 a.m., he'd noted the completion of the repair and the final diagnostic results. All of it gone. He pulled out his phone. He still had the photos, the traffic backup on Meridian taken at 7:18 a.m. He had the time-stamped diagnostic readouts saved to his personal device because he always exported to personal backup before closing a job ticket. It was a habit he'd developed after a system glitch 2 years ago had lost a week of his records. His old floor supervisor had told him he was paranoid. Ethan had said he was cautious, and there was a difference. He plugged in his phone and sent the files to his email. Then he sat and thought. The deleted records were strange. Systems had glitches. Data could get lost. But the particular data that was lost was the particular data that would have explained his absence that morning. That was the kind of coincidence that stopped being coincidence when you thought about it long enough. He thought about the component on Victoria Sterling's desk, the scorch marks, the tool marks that didn't match any standard service procedure. Someone had been inside that Ferrari's engine bay with tools, someone who wasn't on any maintenance schedule. He wrote that thought down on a piece of paper because writing things down made them feel real, and he needed this to feel real. The call came 3 days later. He'd spent those 3 days filing for unemployment benefits, updating his resume, which felt slightly absurd, because who was going to look at a senior diagnostic technician from Velocity Dynamics without asking why he'd left, and trying to project calm in front of Sophie while internally running math he didn't like the answers to. He'd also started making calls, quietly, to former coworkers who picked up because they recognized his number and then lowered their voices because they were at work. The information he gathered was fragmented and uncertain, but it formed a shape. Overtime records had been having issues for the past 6 weeks. Multiple technicians had flagged discrepancies. The night security footage from the private bay where Richard Sterling's Ferrari was stored had been unavailable for a maintenance window that lasted, according to one source who'd heard it from another source, nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Ethan wrote that down too. The call on day 3 came from a number he didn't recognize. Area code was local. Mr. Cross, my name is Daniel Park. I'm the Director of Technical Acquisitions at Meridian Auto Group. Ethan sat up straighter. Meridian Auto Group was Velocity Dynamics' largest regional competitor. Not a terrible company. He'd had colleagues go there, and most of them were reasonably happy, but the timing was sharp enough to be uncomfortable. I'm calling because your name came up in our talent review, Park continued. We've been looking for a senior diagnostics lead for about 4 months, and several people we spoke with mentioned you specifically. I understand you may be evaluating your options at the moment. Word travels fast, Ethan said. This industry's smaller than it looks. A pause. I'd like to schedule a conversation. We can talk about compensation and the role, see if there's a fit. No pressure. Ethan looked at the paper on his kitchen table. The words 2 weeks and tool marks stared back at him. I appreciate the call, he said. Let me think about it. He hung up and sat there. The offer was real. Meridian paid well. They had good equipment and, by all accounts, a functional management structure. He could take that job and solve the math problem and get back to the version of his life where he wasn't spending Sunday nights running numbers and hoping they added up. He thought about the Ferrari. He thought about the scorch marks and the deleted records and the security footage that had been conveniently unavailable. He thought about the look on Victoria Sterling's face when she'd seen that component, that split second before she'd reassembled her expression into something controlled, something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear, but was somewhere in that territory. He didn't call Meridian back. Not yet. What Ethan didn't know, couldn't know, was what happened on the 15th floor of Velocity Dynamics Motors in the 72 hours after he walked out of the building. Victoria Sterling had stood at the supervisor's station for perhaps 45 seconds after Ethan left, long enough for the floor to start moving again, pretending normalcy. Then she'd picked up the scorched component and carried it to her office, and she'd set it on her desk and looked at it. She'd looked at it for a long time. Her father's Ferrari, the 308 GTS, cherry red, bought the year she was born, maintained with a fastidiousness that bordered on devotional. Richard Sterling had not been a sentimental man in most respects. He was precise and demanding and had very little tolerance for excuses, which was where Victoria suspected she'd gotten it from. But he'd kept that car the way some men kept journals. It was the one object in his life that seemed to hold something he couldn't say out loud. He died 14 months ago. Heart attack, private office, alone, the kind of death that seemed to suit him and devastate everyone who'd loved him simultaneously. Victoria had inherited the company, the office, and the impossible weight of trying to be what he'd built without quite being him. She'd inherited the car too, which she'd never driven. It sat in the private bay where he'd always kept it, and the maintenance of it had been transferred quietly to the senior diagnostics team. She called Marcus into her office and asked him to take the component to the independent testing lab they used for warranty disputes. She asked him to have it analyzed. She asked him not to log it through the standard system. Marcus was a 26-year-old with 4 months of experience and the refreshing quality of not yet having learned which questions not to ask. He asked why. "Because I'd like to know the answer before the question is in anyone else's files," she said. He took the component. She then pulled up Ethan's employment file. 9 years. Performance reviews, both consistently strong, occasionally noted as difficult to manage by supervisors. A characterization that usually, in her experience, meant the employee was right more often than the supervisor was comfortable with. Overtime logs. She went back 6 months, then further. His records were clean, consistent, the kind of file that told you a person showed up and did the work. She went to the previous night's entries. 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Nothing. She stared at that blank space. She thought about what he'd said. "I called the floor supervisor at midnight." She pulled up internal call logs. Midway through that search, she had a thought that made her stomach tighten. She was looking at a system that someone had apparently been inside recently. She was looking at records managed by the same system's infrastructure that handled the overnight logs. She stopped searching the call records. She picked up her personal cell phone instead of her desk phone, and she called her assistant, Claire. "I need you to do something for me that's not on the task management system," she said. Claire, who had worked for Richard Sterling for 11 years before working for Victoria and had apparently learned the same lesson about questions, said, "Of course. I need the physical visitor logs for the private vehicle bay for the past 60 days. The paper ones, not the digital entry system. They should be in the security supervisor's office." A pause. "I'll have them within the hour." Victoria hung up and looked at the blank space in Ethan's employment records. She thought, either this is a system error with very convenient timing, or someone wanted him gone. She thought, and if someone wanted him gone, they wanted him gone before today. She thought, what was different about today? And then she thought about the Hartwell partnership and the prototype vehicle that was going to be the centerpiece of the $300 million deal, and the fact that Ethan Cross was the most qualified person in this building to run diagnostics on that vehicle. And her stomach did something cold and unpleasant. She pulled up the prototype service file. 2 days later, the lab called with results on the scorched component. Victoria sat in her car in the parking structure to take the call, not her office. The analyst was a dry, methodical woman named Dr. Sandra Reeves, who'd been doing materials testing for 20 years, and had the manner of someone who found drama distasteful. She went through her findings in order. The scorch marks were consistent with a heat event caused by restricted fuel flow. Specifically, the melting point of the plastic coupling matched what would happen if an injector rail were running at elevated pressure for a sustained period with a partially blocked return line. That part wasn't necessarily surprising. What was surprising, Dr. Reeves said without inflecting it as surprising, was the tool marks. They were consistent with a torque wrench, specifically with tightening a fastener beyond spec. The housing showed deformation around two of the mounting points that was mechanical rather than thermal. Something had been tightened down deliberately, past the point where it should have stopped. The mechanism is straightforward, Dr. Reeves said. Over-torqued mounting causes microcracking in the housing over time. Microcracking causes pressure variance. Pressure variance causes heat buildup. Eventually, the heat event. It's a slow process. Could take months depending on how often the vehicle runs. But if you run the car hard, you accelerate it significantly. How long would it take someone to do this? Victoria asked. To over-torque those fasteners deliberately? Maybe 10 minutes with the right tools. If you knew what you were doing. Victoria thanked her and ended the call. She sat in her car for a while. Then she called Claire again. The visitor logs, she said. What did you find? 3 unscheduled entries for the private bay in the past 45 days, Claire said. All outside normal business hours. All logged under the same executive access code. Whose code? Claire said the name. Victoria sat very still. Sassen. Damien Ashford had been COO of Velocity Dynamics for 3 years. He'd come in under her father, hired from outside, which Richard Sterling rarely did, which meant he'd impressed Richard significantly. He was 51, precise, formally dressed in a way that always made Victoria feel faintly underdressed by comparison. And he had the particular gift of making his own ideas sound like everyone else's consensus. In the 9 months Victoria had been CEO, she'd understood him to be a powerful ally, someone who knew where all the institutional bodies were buried because he'd been there when most of them were interred. She was beginning to understand that this cut both ways. She did not call him. She did not pull up anything that touched his executive profile. Instead, she went to an external attorney, someone her father had used for personal matters, not company counsel, and asked, in general terms, what the legal exposure looked like for corporate misconduct involving safety records and deliberate equipment tampering. The attorney gave her general terms back, and within the general terms was the specific advice: don't move until you have enough to move completely. She thought about Ethan Cross sitting at home, unemployed, with the deleted records that proved he'd been there and a competing job offer that was probably on the table. She thought, I need him back in this building. She picked up the phone. Farmas. Ethan was under his truck when the call came, doing the transmission service himself, because labor costs what labor costs, and he was not currently employed. He heard his phone buzz on the concrete beside him, looked at the screen, and lay there for a moment reading the number. He'd looked up her direct line once, 2 years ago, when he'd needed to escalate an issue with the diagnostic system and his supervisor had been on leave. He recognized it. He slid out from under the truck. Ms. Sterling? Mr. Cross. Her voice on the phone was different than it had been on the floor, less performed somehow. Or maybe it was just the absence of an audience. I'd like to meet with you. In person, not in the building. There's a place on 5th called Henderson's. It's not a business lunch kind of place, which is why I'm suggesting it. When? Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Ethan looked at the truck, at the transmission work half done on his driveway. He looked at the paper on his kitchen table, visible through the window. I'll be there, he said. Op. Henderson's was a diner in the original sense. Not reclaimed wood and exposed brick diner. Actual diner. Formica countertops and coffee in mugs that felt utilitarian and honest. Victoria Sterling was already there when Ethan arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, wearing a blazer that was slightly less formal than what she wore at the plant. She looked like she hadn't slept well. He sat across from her. A server appeared, poured him coffee without asking. Thank you for coming, she said. You said it wasn't a business lunch kind of place. I was curious. She almost smiled. It didn't fully form. The lab results came back on the component you left. He waited. She told him. Not everything. He could tell she was being selective, choosing what to share and in what order. But enough. The over-torquing, the deliberate mechanical interference, the fact that the scorch pattern was consistent with someone engineering a slow failure rather than a fast one. He drank his coffee and let her talk. Your overnight logs were deleted, she said. Not just missing. The slot is gone. I've had our IT infrastructure reviewed by an external team, and the deletion was intentional. Someone with elevated system access removed those records. And the security footage from the private bay? Her expression shifted slightly. You know about that. I talked to people. He set the mug down. 2 weeks of footage unavailable. Convenient timing. Yes. She looked at her untouched coffee. I also have physical visitor logs, paper, not digital, that show the private bay was accessed on 3 occasions in the past 45 days outside of business hours using an executive access code. Whose? She said the name. Ethan absorbed that. Damien Ashford. He'd seen Ashford on the floor occasionally, the COO who moved through the plant with the measured confidence of someone who had decided long ago that confidence was indistinguishable from competence if performed correctly. He'd never had a direct interaction, never had a reason to. Now he had a reason. What do you want from me? He asked. Victoria folded her hands on the table. I want to bring you back. Not as an employee, not right away. That's a board matter, and it'll take time. As an independent consultant, we'd set up a formal agreement, pay you for your expertise, and give you access to the systems and vehicles you need to do a complete technical review. Of the Ferrari. And the prototype. He looked at her. Why the prototype? She met his eyes steadily. Because the component in the Ferrari is from the same manufacturer as a key system in our flagship prototype vehicle, the one that's the centerpiece of the Hartwell Partnership Review. The diner noise continued around them, coffee cups and short-order sounds, and the ambient hum of people having ordinary mornings. You think it's in the prototype too, Ethan said. I think someone made sure you'd be gone before you could find out. Ethan sat with that. He thought about Meridian's offer. He thought about Sophie asking if she should skip lunch. He thought about the paper on his kitchen table and the scorched component and the 9 years of walking into a building that smelled like metal and something that had felt most days like purpose. I'll need full access, he said. No restrictions, no supervision from internal staff, just me and the vehicles. Agreed. And anything I find, you act on. No sitting on it because it's inconvenient. She didn't flinch. Agreed. And I want it in writing before I walk back through that door. I'll have the consulting agreement ready by this afternoon. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. He had the sense, not for the first time, but more clearly now, that she was someone who'd been handed an enormous responsibility and was carrying it imperfectly, the way real things get carried, with the strain visible in her posture and the calculation visible in her eyes. One more thing, he said. What? My overtime records from the night I worked on your father's car. I want them restored, not for legal reasons. They're time-stamped on my personal backup. I've got documentation. I want them restored because someone deleted them to make me look like a liar, and I'm not a liar. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I'll have IT restore them today, she said. He nodded once. All right, he said. I'll come back. The consulting agreement was 4 pages, drafted by her personal attorney rather than company counsel. Ethan read all 4 pages at his kitchen table that evening, while Sophie did homework at the other end, occasionally glancing up at him with the focused peripheral attention of a teenager who knows something important is happening but has correctly assessed that asking will get her nowhere useful. He signed it. Dad, Sophie said without looking up from her textbook. Yeah. Whatever it is, you're going to figure it out. He looked at her. 13 years old, dark hair pulled back, chewing on her pencil in a way he'd been telling her not to do since she was 8. She was looking at her homework like it was the most natural thing in the world to offer that kind of certainty. You don't know what it is, he said. I know you. She turned a page. That's enough. He looked at the signed agreement in front of him. He thought, someone in that building wanted this problem buried. They thought firing me would do it. He thought, They should have thought harder. The component sat on his counter, still wrapped in the shop rag, still scorched. Tomorrow he'd bring it back to the building with him. He'd walk through the door with his name on a consulting agreement and access to every system they had. And he'd start at the beginning, and he'd work until he found what was there to find. He turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the way neighborhoods get in the space between everything. Before the storm, before the answers, before whatever's coming next has fully decided to arrive. Ethan Cross stood at his kitchen counter in the dark for a moment, smelling the faint trace of motor oil that never quite left his hands no matter how well he scrubbed. Then he went to bed. He had an early morning. He had work to do. Ethan arrived at Velocity Dynamics at 7:45 in the morning, which was earlier than he needed to be there, and exactly as early as he intended. He had his copy of the consulting agreement folded in his jacket pocket. He had his personal diagnostic kit in a hard case under his arm. He had coffee in a travel mug because the building's coffee had always been bad, and he'd spent 9 years pretending otherwise. The security desk was staffed by a guard named Phil, who'd worked the morning entrance for at least 6 of those 9 years. Phil looked up, recognized him, looked briefly uncertain. The particular uncertainty of someone who knows a thing happened but not the details of the thing, and then looked at the paperwork Victoria's office had apparently sent down the night before. "Mr. Cross," Phil said, "consulting access. You're in the system." "Morning, Phil." Phil printed a temporary badge and slid it across the desk. It was a different color than the one Ethan had surrendered, contractor blue instead of employee green, and he clipped it to his jacket without comment. He went to his old workbench first, not because he had access to it yet, but because he needed to see it. Someone had cleared it. The tools were gone, redistributed back to the general pool, and the surface had been wiped down. It looked like a bench that had never belonged to anyone. He stood there for a moment, feeling that small, specific loss, then turned and walked toward the private vehicle bay. The Ferrari was exactly where he'd left it. He set down his kit, opened it, and went to work. The repair he'd done the week before was intact. He checked it first, methodically, because that was procedure. The new injector rail assembly seated correctly. Pressure readings at normal spec. The scorched housing was gone, sitting in an evidence bag at an independent lab. What he was looking for now wasn't the damage he'd already found. He was looking for what else might be there, in the areas he hadn't fully examined during those 7 hours when he'd been focused on preventing a fire rather than documenting a crime. He worked for 2 hours in that bay, alone, with the kind of focused quiet that came from years of knowing that machines told the truth if you asked them the right questions. He found 3 additional anomalies, small things, things that would look like normal wear to a general inspection, things that became significant only when you understood the pattern they were part of. He photographed each one. He logged them to a file on his personal device before entering anything into the company's system. He was closing up the Ferrari's hood when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Victoria was standing at the bay entrance, hands in the pockets of a jacket slightly less formal than her usual, which he was beginning to understand was her version of casual. She looked at the Ferrari, then at him. "Anything?" she asked. 3 additional points of interest. He leaned against the workbench. None of them as acute as the fuel rail, but all of them in the same category. Mechanical interference designed to look like wear. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. She came further into the bay. Meaning this wasn't someone who watched a YouTube video on how to sabotage a car. The points of interference are specific. They're in places that a standard service check wouldn't prioritize. You'd have to be running a full diagnostic protocol with an eye toward this particular failure mode to catch them. He paused. That's a level of technical knowledge that narrows the field significantly. Victoria looked at the Ferrari. Her expression was the controlled one, the one she defaulted to when she was working hard to keep her face professional, but he could see the edges of something else around it. "My father drove that car to events," she said. "He had a charity gala 3 weeks before he died. He took the Ferrari." "When did you last have it serviced before my quarterly diagnostic?" "I'd have to check. It would have been before his death, so at least 14 months. If the over-torquing was done in the past 45 days, which is what the visitor logs suggest, Then whoever did it knew the car wasn't being driven regularly. They had time. He watched her face. A slow failure in a stored vehicle could go undetected indefinitely, unless someone ran the specific diagnostic I ran. She turned to look at him, which was scheduled 6 weeks in advance. On my maintenance calendar, visible to anyone with access to team scheduling. The quiet in the bay was a different quality than the quiet on the main floor. Thicker, more aware of itself. You think someone knew the diagnostic was coming, she said. I think someone had a reason to want me gone before the diagnostic happened. She absorbed that. He watched her work through the implications, watched her face do the thing where she was 10 steps ahead and trying to decide how many of those steps to show. She was like her father in that too, he realized. Richard Sterling had been a man who made decisions before he announced them, so the announcement was always the last step, never the first. I need you to look at the prototype, she said. I know, that's next. I mean today. Not this week. Today. Something in her voice had tightened. The Hartwell Partnership Review has been rescheduled for 3 weeks from now. They were understanding about the original delay. They won't be understanding if we ask for a second postponement. I need to know what's in that vehicle before I make any promises to anyone. He looked at her. The prototype's in Bay 7? Yes. I'll clear everyone out of that section. Give me an hour to finish documenting what I found in here. Then I'll start on the prototype. He paused. And Miss Sterling, Victoria, she said. It came out like a correction she'd been holding for a few days. He adjusted. Victoria, I need access to the full component procurement records for the prototype build. Every part, every supplier, every installation log. I'll have them sent to the terminal in Bay 7. Internal system? She hesitated. Just a half second. I'll have Claire print them. He nodded. She'd already understood. The internal system was compromised territory. Paper was inconvenient and therefore safer. She left. He turned back to the Ferrari, photographed the third anomaly from 2 more angles, and wrote 4 lines of notes on a legal pad he'd brought from home. Bay 7 held the prototype under a fitted cover, black, branded with the Velocity Dynamics logo, the kind of thing that was designed to be photogenic for reveal events. Ethan pulled the cover off himself, folded it without ceremony, and set it on a nearby stool. The vehicle was genuinely impressive. He'd seen the development specs. He'd worked on subsystems in the early build phase 3 years ago. But the finished version was a different thing. Long chassis, composite body panels, the aggressive proportion of something built to make a statement before it made a journey. The production team had done exceptional work. The paint alone was worth looking at. He wasn't there to look at the paint. He started at the front and worked back, same as always, same methodology he'd used on 10,000 vehicles. The sequence so embedded in his muscle memory that he could hold a full conversation while doing it. But he wasn't having a conversation. He was reading. The printed procurement records were stacked beside him, 312 pages, which was a significant amount of paper and an accurate reflection of how complex the prototype build had been. He cross-referenced as he went, checking what the record said against what his instruments were saying, looking for gaps. There were no gaps for the first 90 minutes. The prototype was clean, remarkably clean, honestly, which was a reflection of how much money and talent had gone into building it. He noted 2 minor items that needed adjustment. Standard stuff, the kind of thing you'd catch in any pre-delivery inspection. He logged them and kept moving. He reached the primary drive control module at the 2-hour mark. It was housed in a sealed compartment in the rear chassis. Standard location for this vehicle class, accessible via a panel that required 2 specific tools to open correctly. He opened it. He looked at the module for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. I need you in Bay 7, he said. What did you find? I need you in Bay 7, he said again. She arrived in 4 minutes, which meant she'd been somewhere nearby, which meant she'd been waiting. She stopped beside him, looked at the open panel, looked at the module. Tell me what I'm looking at, she said. Drive control module. It manages power distribution to the axle systems. Basically, the brain of how this vehicle behaves at speed. He pointed without touching. See the secondary coupling on the left side? The connector? That connector should be this component. He held up the procurement records, open to the right page. That's what the records show was installed. Part number VD7712C, sourced from Kenworth Technical Systems, installed at Build Week 22. She looked at the page, then back at the module. And what's actually installed? I don't know the exact part number yet. I need to pull it and run it. He looked at her directly. But I know it's not a VD7712C. The housing dimensions are different. The connector interface is a slightly different configuration. Whoever swapped it knew enough to make it look right from a visual inspection. The color coding is the same. The label on the outer casing reads correctly. But it's not the same part. Victoria stood very still. At the speeds this vehicle is designed to demonstrate, Ethan said carefully, a failure in the drive control module doesn't produce a warning light and a diagnostic code. It produces loss of directional control. At demonstration speed, she said. Yes. She closed her eyes. Just briefly. 3 seconds? Maybe 4. Then she opened them and they were clear, which was either very good control or a certain kind of internal quiet that came from a decision already made. Pull it, she said. I need your authorization logged. You have it. He pulled the component with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who understood that the thing in his hands mattered. He set it on the workbench and ran his initial scan. The diagnostic returned a part identifier that matched nothing in Velocity Dynamics' approved component database. He ran it twice to be sure. This part doesn't exist in your procurement system, he said, which means it wasn't purchased through normal channels. Victoria was standing behind him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, slightly faster than normal, though she'd never have admitted it. Someone brought it in. Someone brought it in, swapped it during a maintenance window, and updated the installation record to show the original part. He set the component in an evidence bag. He'd brought evidence bags because he'd had a feeling he might need them. The same someone who has the technical knowledge to do it cleanly, the system access to alter records, and a history of after-hours access to restricted bays. Neither of them said the name. I want to know something, Ethan said, not turning around. Before we go any further, I want to know if you knew. The silence had weight to it. No, she said. I didn't know. He turned then. She was looking at him with an expression that was less controlled than her usual, which he'd come to understand was her version of letting someone in. It didn't look comfortable. It looked like someone standing in a doorway they weren't sure about. I need to know because of what comes next, he said. What comes next is going to be difficult, and I need to be able to trust the person I'm doing it with. You can trust me. Her jaw was set. You fired me without hearing a full sentence. I know. Something moved in her expression. I know I did. They looked at each other in the bay, with the prototype between them and a bagged component on the workbench and the particular tension of two people who'd started from opposite sides of a disaster and somehow ended up in the same place. All right, he said. Here's what we do next. He worked through lunch, which he ate at the workbench without sitting down. A sandwich Sophie had made and packed into his kit that morning without telling him, wrapped in foil with a piece of tape labeled "Eat This" in her handwriting. He found it when he was looking for a specific calibration tool and stood there for a moment holding it, feeling something complicated and warm. He ate the sandwich and kept working. The full analysis of the swapped component took 3 hours, including 2 calls to an external engineer he trusted, a former colleague named Bert Okafor, who now ran an independent automotive consulting firm and had the useful quality of not asking more questions than the situation called for. Where did this come from? Bert asked after Ethan read him the component specs. I'll tell you later. Is this vehicle going to be driven by a person? It was scheduled to be demonstrated in 3 weeks. A pause. At what speed? Ethan told him. Another pause. Longer. Then whoever put this in knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what would happen, Bert said. At that speed, under the load conditions of a demonstration run, this component fails between 12 and 18 minutes of operation. The failure mode is gradual. It won't be dramatic at first, which means the driver won't have immediate warning. By the time they understand something is wrong, they won't have full directional response. Ethan wrote that down. This isn't just a safety issue, Bert said. This is engineered harm. Someone built a timetable. Thanks, Bert. You should call someone official. I'm working on it. He hung up and looked at his notes. He thought about who would have been driving that prototype at the demonstration. He thought about Victoria in the driver's seat, in front of Hartwell International executives, on a closed track at demonstration speed, at minute 13 of the run. He thought about Sophie's sandwich wrapper in the trash beside the workbench. He put his phone in his pocket and went to find Victoria. She was in her office, which was where she went when she needed to think. He was learning her patterns, the way you learn anyone's patterns when you spend enough concentrated time around them. Her office was on the building's second level, glass-fronted, overlooking the main floor. Richard Sterling had been able to see everything from that office. Victoria had the blinds angled so she could see the floor without being clearly visible from it, which was a different management philosophy expressed in a physical detail. He told her what Bert had said. He was direct about it, not because he was trying to upset her, but because she deserved the full information, and he'd watched enough people receive bad news to know that softening it didn't actually help. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Who was scheduled to drive the prototype at the demonstration? He asked. I was, she said. The words landed between them with the flat weight of something that couldn't be taken back. There were going to be 12 Hartwell executives watching, she continued. Her voice was very steady. The demonstration was supposed to run for 20 minutes, fast passes on a closed track. She paused. My father built this company. I was going to drive the car that proved it could continue without him. Ethan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't diminished by saying it. Damien was the one who suggested the demonstration format, she said. 6 weeks ago. I thought it was a good idea. A short, humorless exhale. He was quite enthusiastic about the plan. When was the last time Damien accessed the prototype bay? She turned to her computer. I've been pulling access logs, the physical security records, not the digital system. She scanned a page. 4 occasions in the past 2 months, 3 of them during off hours. She looked up. The component swap, based on the installation log timestamp, would have happened during a Friday evening window, 6 weeks ago. The same Friday he proposed the demonstration format? She stared at him. That's a working hypothesis, Ethan said carefully. We don't know the exact sequence. The same Friday, she repeated more quietly. He came into my office that afternoon and spent 40 minutes talking about how exciting the demonstration would be for investor confidence. The afternoon light through the office window was going amber. The floor below was beginning the last hour rhythm, tools being stowed, shift notes being exchanged, the daily winding down of a place that ran on schedule. Ethan looked out at it. 20-some years of combined experience among those technicians down there, all of them working in good faith inside a system someone had been quietly corrupting. We need documentation, he said. Everything. The component analysis from the Ferrari, the lab results from Dr. Reeves, the visitor log entries, the procurement record discrepancy, Bert's analysis. We need it organized and we need it solid, because when this goes to the board, someone's going to try to pick it apart. I know. And we need to be careful about how we move. If Damien realizes you're building a case, he has time to control the narrative. He has allies on the board. I'm guessing he's been there long enough to have cultivated several. 3, minimum, she said without hesitation, which told him she'd already been thinking about this. So we move quietly and then completely. He looked at her. No half measures. When you go to the board, you go with everything. She nodded once, the kind of nod that was a commitment rather than an agreement. That's going to take time, he said, to compile correctly, which means we have a period where we have to act normal. Damien has to believe you're proceeding with the original plan. He wants to believe that. He'll be looking for confirmation. Give it to him. She held his gaze. You're asking me to pretend I trust him. I'm asking you to not show him that you don't. There's a difference. The office was quiet. From below, a compressor shut down and the floor got fractionally quieter. I'm not good at pretending, she said. I noticed. He picked up his jacket from the chair back. You're going to have to get better at it for about 2 weeks. He said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly, and she received it the same way, as information rather than criticism. He was learning that about her too. She could take a hard truth if it came without performance. What she couldn't tolerate was being managed. He was almost at the office door when she said, "Ethan." He turned. "The sandwich," she said. "You had a sandwich at the workbench. Did someone make that for you?" It was a strange question, and he almost deflected it. "My daughter." She looked at him for a moment. "How old?" 13. Something crossed her face. Small, brief, not quite identifiable. "She made you lunch." "She does that. She's better at it than she should be at her age." He paused. "Her mom left when she was 4. It's just us." Victoria was quiet. "She knows something's going on," he said. "She doesn't know the details. But she packed a sandwich." He left it at that. "I'll have everything ready for compilation by tomorrow morning," Victoria said. 7 a.m. 7 a.m., he confirmed, and left. But he drove home through the kind of traffic that gave a person time to think whether they wanted it or not. The radio played something he didn't listen to. The city moved around him, streetlights coming on, people heading to restaurants and grocery stores and home, ordinary Tuesday evening life in progress. He thought about minute 13 of a 20-minute demonstration run. He thought about Damien Ashford spending 40 minutes in Victoria's office talking about investor confidence, while 6 weeks prior, he'd spent a Friday evening in the prototype bay making sure the demonstration would end with something other than success. He thought about what Bert had said. This isn't just a safety issue. This is engineered harm. Someone had made a decision, careful, calculated, sustained over weeks or months, that another person's life was acceptable collateral. And they'd made that decision in a building full of people who came to work every day and did their jobs honestly and had no idea what was growing inside the institution around them. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, he could see Sophie at the table, homework spread out, her headphones in, completely absorbed in whatever she was working on. She had a pen in her hand and she was writing fast, the way she did when she was actually engaged, and her hair was doing the thing where it fell forward and she'd push it back without looking up. He watched her for a moment through the glass. Then he got out of the truck, went inside, and told her dinner was on him. "Chinese?" she asked, without taking the headphones out. "Whatever you want." She looked up at that. Because he never said whatever you want. He said within reason or pick something under $20. And she searched his face for a second with those sharp eyes that saw more than a 13-year-old should probably see. "You made progress," she said. He sat down across from her. "Yeah." "Good progress or complicated progress?" "Complicated progress." He picked up her pen and set it straight beside her notebook. A habit, she always left it at an angle. Both kinds, actually. She considered that. "Chinese and then you tell me about it?" "Not the details." "Obviously not the details. Just the shape of it." He looked at her. His kid, his daughter, the person who'd made him a sandwich and labeled it with tape, and felt the particular exhaustion and gratitude and low-grade fear that came with loving someone that much in a world that didn't always cooperate. "Yeah," he said, "Chinese and then the shape of it." She pulled out her headphones and went to get the takeout menu. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands, still faintly stained from a long day of work, and thought about what was coming. 2 weeks. Compile everything. Move quietly and then completely. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what it always did. The ordinary sounds of people living their lives, unaware of the things being decided in the spaces between. Ethan Cross sat at his kitchen table, waiting for takeout menus and thinking about engineered harm, and understood clearly, perhaps for the first time since the morning he'd been fired, exactly what he was in the middle of. He wasn't just trying to get his job back. He was trying to stop something that hadn't finished happening yet. The 2 weeks passed the way difficult waiting always passes. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a grinding unevenness that made some hours feel like days and some days disappear entirely. Ethan came in at 7 each morning and left after dark. He ate at workbenches. He drank bad coffee from the break room machine because he kept forgetting to bring his own. He built a documentation file that grew from 12 pages to 47, then to 93, organized in a way that told a story even if you came to it cold. A story about a series of deliberate choices made by someone who understood how institutions worked and how to move inside them without leaving obvious shadows. Victoria, for her part, was doing something genuinely difficult. She was being normal. She sat in meetings with Damien Ashford and discussed the Hartwell timeline without blinking. She answered his questions about the prototype demonstration with the measured confidence of someone who had no reason not to. Twice Ethan saw them in the hallway together, Damien talking, Victoria listening, her face arranged in the attentive expression she used when she was receiving information she intended to act on. From 10 feet away, she looked like a CEO managing a morning. Up close, he suspected the jaw was doing the thing where it tightened at the hinge. But Damien wasn't looking that closely. That was the problem with people who believed they were the smartest person in a room. They stopped checking. Ethan watched all of this from the periphery of the building, which was where a contractor with a temporary badge existed. He was present, but not quite internal. People greeted him, some of them warmly, the way coworkers greet someone who's been gone a few weeks. Slightly differently than before, recalibrated. He noticed that Marcus, who'd been sent in his place on the day he was fired, made a point of stopping by Bay 7 twice to ask questions that didn't strictly need asking. He was 26 and earnest, and he reminded Ethan of himself at that age, before the years had worn certain rougher edges in. He answered Marcus's questions patiently. On day 9, Ethan found the financial thread. He hadn't been looking for it exactly. He'd been cross-referencing supplier records, legitimate technical work, part of documenting the component discrepancy in the prototype, when he noticed something in the procurement invoice trail that didn't belong. The component in the prototype, the one with the false identifier, had a paper trail that led back through 2 intermediary vendors before disappearing into a third company that existed, technically, as a registered entity, but had no physical address and no verifiable business history beyond 18 months. He pulled that thread carefully. The third company, listed in the invoice trail as Meridian Technical Solutions, which was not the same as Meridian Auto Group, though the name similarity was interesting, shared a registered agent with 2 other entities. One of those entities was a private investment group. The investment group had a position in a competitor firm, a firm that stood to gain significantly from Velocity Dynamics losing the Hartwell partnership. He wrote all of this down 3 times, in 3 different places, because documentation that only existed in one location was documentation that could disappear. On the evening of day 9, he drove to Henderson's, the diner where they'd had their first real conversation, and waited. Victoria arrived 11 minutes after him, still in her work blazer, looking like someone who'd been performing normal for 9 days and was running low on whatever internal resource that required. She sat across from him and didn't say anything for a moment. The server came, poured coffee, left. "Tell me," she said. He told her about the investment trail. He watched her face as he laid it out. The supplier chain, the shell company, the investment position. She was a CEO. She understood corporate structure well enough to follow it without him drawing a diagram, and she followed it now with the focused attention of someone assembling something in real time. When he finished, she looked at her coffee. "He's been building toward this for how long?" she said. Not a question exactly. Based on the company registration date of the shell entity, at least 18 months. Possibly longer. That's just when he formalized the investment structure. Ethan turned the mug in his hands. "He came in under your father. Richard Sterling hired him. I've been wondering if your father ever noticed anything." Something crossed her face at her father's name. That involuntary tightening she couldn't quite train out of herself. "My father trusted him," she said. "Completely. Damien had a way of—" She stopped. "He makes you feel like he's doing you a favor by being honest with you. Like his candor is a gift he's choosing to give. My father valued candor above most things." "Someone who weaponizes candor is more dangerous than someone who lies outright," Ethan said. "You can catch a liar. The other kind, you only catch when you're already in the damage." She looked at him. "You sound like someone who's encountered that before." "Sophie's mother." He said it simply, not like it was a wound anymore, but like a fact that had become part of the landscape. "Told me everything I wanted to hear, very convincingly, for 3 years. When she left, the thing I couldn't figure out wasn't why she left. It was how I'd missed the gap between what she said and what was real." He paused. "I got better at looking for gaps." Victoria absorbed that in silence. Outside the diner window, the city was doing its evening thing. She picked up her coffee, finally. and drank some. The investment position, she said. If Velocity Dynamics loses the Hartwell deal, what's the exposure? The competitor firm gains primary negotiating position with Hartwell. They've been second in line on this deal for 8 months. Hartwell preferred us on the technical specs, but they have ongoing conversations with the competitor. If we fail the demonstration, or if the partnership falls apart due to questions about our safety standards, Hartwell goes to the next option. He paused. The investment group's position in the competitor firm is significant enough that a successful pivot of the Hartwell deal represents an 8-figure return. She set the mug down. He was going to watch me drive that prototype, she said quietly. He was going to be standing with the Hartwell executives when, yes. And then he was going to step in, manage the crisis, probably argue that my leadership had compromised the company's safety culture, that the board needed to make a change. That's the shape of it, Ethan said. She didn't say anything for a while. He let the silence sit because it needed to. This wasn't the kind of information you immediately moved past. It was the kind you had to stand in for a minute, let it settle to its actual weight. He came to my father's funeral, she said eventually. He stood at the graveside and told me Richard was the finest man he'd ever worked for, and that he was going to do everything in his power to protect what he'd built. A short, quiet exhale. I believed him. I know. I gave him access to everything, because I was 29 and I'd just inherited a company I wasn't sure I could run, and he'd been here for years, and I thought, she stopped. That he knew things you needed to know, Ethan said. That's not a failure of character. That's a reasonable response to a reasonable problem. It was naive. It was human. He said it firmly enough that she looked at him. There's a difference. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked away. At the diner counter, at the ordinary Wednesday evening life proceeding around them. We're ready, she said. 93 pages. Both component analyses. The financial trail. The visitor logs. The system access records you pulled. I added 6 more pages this afternoon. The invoice chain and the corporate registration documents. He reached into his jacket and set a flash drive on the table between them. Everything is on there. Physical copies are in 2 separate locations. She looked at the flash drive, small, ordinary, the kind of object that contained nothing until it contained everything. I want external verification before we go to the board, she said. I want someone who has no connection to this company or any of the parties involved to look at the technical findings and confirm them independently. I called Bert Okafor this morning, Ethan said. He's available Thursday. And the financial documentation? I have a forensic accountant. She's done work for my personal attorney. I'll call her tonight. 2 to 3 days for verification, Ethan said. Then the board. The board meeting is scheduled for Friday of next week. Regular quarterly session. She was planning now. He could see it. The part of her that functioned best when the path was clear and the steps were identified. I'll add an agenda item. Governance review. That's broad enough not to trigger attention. Damien will be in that meeting. Yes. Her voice was level. He will. Is that a problem? She picked up the flash drive and put it in her jacket pocket. No, she said. That's an advantage. I want him in the room when it happens. She said it the way her father had said things when he'd made up his mind. Flat and final. No air left in it for reconsideration. Ethan had seen Richard Sterling say things in that tone once or twice, years ago, from a distance. He understood now where she'd gotten it from, and also where she'd diverged from it. Richard's finality had come from certainty. Victoria's came from something harder won, from someone who doubted herself and decided anyway. He respected that more. They paid for the coffee and left separately, as they'd been doing, careful about the optics of their collaboration until the time for being careful was finished. Thursday brought Bert Okafor in a rental car and a windbreaker that looked like it had survived several field seasons. He was 54, originally from Lagos, with a physicist's precision in his hands and a mechanic's directness in his speech. He'd worked with Ethan at a previous firm before starting his own consultancy, and their professional relationship was based almost entirely on mutual respect for correct answers, regardless of inconvenience. Bert spent 6 hours in Bay 7 with the prototype. He also spent 2 hours reviewing the Ferrari documentation, the lab results from Dr. Reeves, and Ethan's annotated notes. He asked pointed questions that required precise answers. He did not make conversation during the technical portions of the day, and Ethan appreciated that. At 4 in the afternoon, Bert sat on a workbench stool, removed his glasses, and cleaned them with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant he was organizing a conclusion. The component in the prototype, he said, is a knockoff derivative of a genuine drive control module. It's been manufactured to approximate the visual profile of the correct part, but it functions on a different operating threshold. Under sustained load conditions, the thermal tolerance of the internal regulator exceeds its rated ceiling somewhere between 11 and 15 minutes of hard operation. He put his glasses back on. This is not ambiguous. I'm happy to produce a written report. Please, Ethan said. The Ferrari documentation is consistent with deliberate mechanical interference. The over-torquing pattern is specific and knowledgeable. Someone understood what they were doing. He looked at Ethan. These two incidents are related. Same methodology, same category of harm, same technical sophistication. Same person? I can't say that in a report, but the signature is consistent. Victoria was in the bay. She'd been there for Bert's findings, standing slightly apart, listening. She asked, "Would you testify to these conclusions?" Bert looked at her directly. "Are you asking me if I'm willing to put my name on this in a formal proceeding?" Yes, he said. "I'm willing. The findings are defensible, and I'll defend them." She nodded. "Thank you." After Bert left, the bay was quiet. The late afternoon had gone gray outside the high windows. Ethan was putting equipment away, the methodical end-of-day routine that his hands knew without supervision, when Victoria said from behind him, "I almost called it off twice." He turned. She was leaning against the prototype, arms crossed, looking at the floor. "The investigation. When I first started pulling records, there was a point where I thought, if I'm wrong, if this turns out to be something more explainable, I've gone to war with my COO over a parts discrepancy and a car that needed maintenance. But you kept pulling, because the alternative was pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen." She looked up. "I'm not good at that." "I noticed that too," he said. She almost smiled, the same way she had at the diner, the expression that started and didn't fully arrive. "My father was. He could compartmentalize anything. I always thought it was a strength. It is. Until it isn't." She looked at the prototype beside her, the car that had been turned into a mechanism for harm by someone who'd understood exactly how to exploit the trust surrounding it. He spent a year building this vehicle. The team did. They're proud of it. They should be proud of it. A pause. "I'm not going to let what Damien did to it be the thing people remember." "They won't," Ethan said. He meant it. She straightened. "Friday next week. The board meeting. I'll be there. As a consultant. As a witness," he said. "If that's what's needed." She looked at him for a moment. That assessing look she'd trained on him the day she fired him, the one that now had a different quality to it, like the same instrument reading a different frequency. "You could have taken the Meridian offer," she said. "You could have walked away from all of this." "I know." "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, not reaching for the answer that sounded best. Because the component in that Ferrari was going to cause a fire eventually, and the component in this car was going to cause something worse. And I knew both of those things, and I couldn't unknow them. He picked up his kit. That's all. She looked at him a moment longer, then she said, "Get some sleep, Ethan." "You too," he said, knowing she wouldn't. He did not get much sleep. The week before the board meeting had its own particular texture, the tight, watchful quality of a held breath. Ethan came in each day and worked. He added final documentation to the file. He reviewed everything twice, looking for gaps, for anything that could be picked apart or reframed. He thought about Damien Ashford's board allies and how they'd receive the information, whether loyalty or self-preservation would win in the room. He thought about the difference between having enough evidence and having evidence delivered correctly, and he prepared for both. On Wednesday, 3 days before the board meeting, he got a call from Daniel Park at Meridian Auto Group. "Mr. Cross, just following up on our previous conversation, we're finalizing our hiring decisions this week and I wanted to check in on where you were. Ethan was in the parking structure eating lunch in his truck because the break room had been crowded. I appreciate you following up, he said. I'm not going to be able to move forward with the conversation. A pause. Can I ask if you've accepted something else? I'm resolving some things where I am. Another pause. Longer. I want to be straightforward with you. We became aware that you'd been let go from Velocity Dynamics, and I'll tell you honestly, the timing of our outreach was not entirely coincidental. We were aware of a situation and we moved quickly. Ethan looked out the windshield. What situation? We heard through industry channels that there were questions about safety protocols at Velocity Dynamics. Specific questions. Frankly, when that kind of thing circulates, companies in our position pay attention. Who was circulating it? A careful pause. I'm not in a position to say, but I'll tell you it came through a channel I've since become less confident about. Ethan thought about that. Thank you for telling me, he said. Good luck, Mr. Cross. Genuinely. He put the phone down and sat with what Park had just told him. Someone had been seeding doubt about Velocity Dynamics' safety culture through industry channels. Early, before anything had become public, before there was any formal allegation. Seeding the story before the story broke, so that when it did break, it would land in soil that was already prepared. That was the part of the plan he hadn't fully mapped. Not just the sabotage, not just the corporate maneuvering, the narrative management running alongside it. He wrote it down and added it to the documentation. Friday arrived with the particular clarity of a day that has been a long time coming. The quarterly board meeting was held in the large conference room on the 15th floor, the same room where the Hartwell executives had sat 6 weeks ago and found no one ready to present to them. 12 board members. Damian Ashford on the COO's side of the table, in his usual place, in his usual dark suit, projecting the specific confidence of someone who had decided long ago that the room was always manageable. Victoria had added the agenda item as planned, Governance and Safety Protocol Review, which was the kind of phrase that produced mild interest rather than alarm. She'd told no one what it contained. She'd sent Ethan a text at 6 in the morning that read, 7th floor waiting room, 8:45 and nothing else. He arrived at 8:40. He was wearing the best jacket he owned, which was not expensive but was clean. He sat in the 7th floor waiting room with the full documentation file in a folder on his lap and watched the elevator doors. At 8:52, Victoria came down. She was in the charcoal blazer, the same one she'd worn the morning she fired him, or one exactly like it. He wondered if that was deliberate. She looked at him, then at the folder. The forensic accountant confirmed the financial trail, she said. The report came in last night. It's in the board packet. Board members have already received it? 30 minutes ago. Electronic delivery, marked confidential. She met his eyes. Damian doesn't know what's in the packet. Has he read it yet? He will in about 10 minutes. Ethan stood. Then, let's go up. They rode the elevator to the 15th floor without speaking. The doors opened to the hallway outside the conference room, and from inside they could already hear the particular sound of a meeting that had just received information it wasn't prepared for. Voices overlapping, the scrape of chairs, the charged quality of a room in the process of recalibrating. Victoria stopped at the conference room door. She straightened her jacket. It was a small automatic gesture, the kind people make when they're about to walk into something hard, and they're doing it on purpose. She put her hand on the door. You ready? Ethan asked. No, she said. Let's go. She pushed the door open and walked in. Ethan followed, one step behind, folder in hand, and the room turned to look at them both. He scanned the table quickly. 12 board members at various stages of processing what they'd read, 2 assistants near the wall, and at the far side of the table, Damian Ashford with the board packet open in front of him and an expression that had gone very still. It was the stillness of someone who had just realized that the room he'd spent 18 months designing was no longer the room he was standing in. Victoria took her chair at the head of the table. She set her own folder down and looked at the board without preamble. I want to start with the technical findings, she said. Mr. Cross will present them. He is the most qualified person in this building to do so, and what he found affects every decision we make in this room today. Every head turned toward Ethan. He stood at the side of the room, folder open to the first page. He looked at Damien Ashford once, one direct, steady look, and then looked at the board. "Thank you," he said. "I'll start with the Ferrari." And he began. Ethan had presented technical findings before, to supervisors, to floor teams, to clients who needed to understand why a vehicle wasn't safe to drive. He was comfortable with the language of evidence. What he wasn't comfortable with, and never had been, was the particular kind of attention that came from a room full of people who understood that what they were hearing was going to change something significant. That kind of attention had weight. You could feel it pressing back against you while you talked. He talked for 41 minutes. He went through it the way he'd organized it, sequentially, methodically, letting each layer establish the foundation for the next. The Ferrari first, the diagnostic anomaly, the over-torqued housing, Dr. Reeves' lab findings, the deliberate nature of the interference. He put the photographs on the conference room screen without editorializing them. He let the scorch marks speak in the language they were designed to speak. Then the prototype, the component discrepancy, the false part identifier, Bert Okafor's independent verification, which he summarized and then distributed as a printed report, the failure timeline, 11 to 15 minutes of hard operation, loss of directional control, a closed demonstration track with 12 observers, and a CEO in the driver's seat. He stated all of this in flat technical language, and the flatness of it made it worse, not better, because there was nothing to argue with. Numbers and timelines don't perform. Then, the access records. The visitor log entries, the pattern of after-hours access to restricted bays under a specific executive code. He did not say Damien's name during this portion. He read the access code numbers. He let the board members look across the table and do that work themselves. Then the financial trail. He was less certain on this ground. It was outside his technical expertise, but the forensic accountant's report was thorough, and he summarized it accurately and told them to read the full document, which they had. When he finished, he closed the folder and stood quietly. The room was the kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible. He glanced at Damien Ashford. In 41 minutes, Damien had not moved significantly. He'd turned pages in the packet. He'd made 2 brief notes on a legal pad beside him, and then stopped making notes. His face had done something during the financial section. A tightening around the eyes, so controlled and brief that most people probably missed it. Ethan hadn't missed it. A board member on the left side of the table, older man, silver hair, the kind of careful bearing that came from 50 years of rooms like this, spoke first. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was the longest tenured member of the board, which meant he'd been there when Richard Sterling built this company and had opinions about what it owed its founder's legacy. "Ms. Sterling," Marsh said. Not to Ethan. "You're presenting this to the board today rather than through legal or regulatory channels first. I want to understand the reasoning." "Because the board governs this company," Victoria said, "and the board needs to govern it with full information. External channels come next. Today, you hear it first." "And the Hartwell partnership?" "Postponed until we have a clean vehicle and a clean record." She said it without hesitation. "I will call James Hartwell personally this afternoon." Marsh looked at her steadily. "A postponement may end the negotiation." "It may." She met his eyes. "I'm aware of that. $300 million. I'm aware of the number, Gerald." Her voice was level, not cold, but with a finality to it that didn't invite debate on the underlying decision. "I'm also aware that if we proceed with the demonstration as planned, we proceed with a vehicle that has been deliberately compromised. And if something happens on that track, the question won't be whether we lose the Hartwell deal. The question will be whether this company exists in the same form 6 months later." Marsh sat back. He didn't argue. On the far end of the table, one of Damien's allies, a man named Colton, mid-50s, who joined the board 2 years ago at Damien's recommendation, cleared his throat. "I think what's being presented here warrants significant scrutiny before any personnel actions are considered. We're talking about serious allegations based on independent forensic analysis," Ethan said. He said it without aggression, without volume, just as a clarification. 2 independent experts. Physical evidence that is currently in documented storage. Records that exist on paper, not just in digital systems that have demonstrated vulnerability. Colton looked at him with the expression of someone who doesn't appreciate being corrected by a contractor in a visitor badge. "Mr. Cross," Colton said, "you have a personal interest in this outcome. You were terminated by this company. I think the board has to take that into account." "That's fair," Ethan said. "Which is why both technical findings were independently verified by Bert Okafor, who has no connection to Velocity Dynamics or any party in this room, and the financial documentation was produced by a forensic accountant engaged through external counsel." He paused. "My personal interest doesn't change what the parts say." Colton opened his mouth and closed it. Damien Ashford spoke for the first time. His voice was exactly what it always was, measured, resonant, carrying the texture of someone accustomed to being heard. "I want to be clear that I take these findings seriously. All of us should." He set his pen down beside the legal pad. "But what I'm seeing here is a chain of circumstantial evidence being presented as concluded fact. Access logs show that my code was used. They don't show that I used it. Records have gaps. Records have gaps for many reasons. I would ask the board not to conflate suggestive evidence with definitive proof." The room received this. Several members shifted slightly, the unconscious physical response of people considering a competing frame. Victoria looked at Damien across the table. She'd been waiting for him to speak. Ethan could see it in the way her posture didn't change when he did. She'd already prepared for whatever he was going to say. "Damien," she said. "The access code that logged 3 after-hours entries to the restricted vehicle bay. Is there a record of anyone else using that code during those windows? Executive codes are confidential. I can't, yes or no. To your knowledge, has anyone else ever been issued your executive access code?" A beat. "No." "And on the 3 dates in question, were you in the building?" Another beat, slightly longer. "I'd need to review my calendar." "I have your calendar," she said. She opened the folder in front of her. "I pulled it from the executive scheduling system Wednesday morning. On all 3 dates, your calendar shows no evening commitments, no noted travel, no external events." The room was very still. "That doesn't constitute," he began. "I'm not presenting it as a conclusion," Victoria said. "I'm presenting it as a fact among other facts, which is what Mr. Cross has been doing for the past 41 minutes. She closed the folder. "The board will note all of it and determine next steps. That's the process." Damien looked at her. His face was still controlled. He was extraordinarily good at that, at keeping the surface managed. But something underneath had shifted. Ethan could see it the way he could see a pressure variance in a fuel system before the instruments caught it. Something had given. "I want it noted," Damien said, "that I have served this company for 3 years with complete dedication. I came here under Richard Sterling's direct recruitment. My record speaks for itself." "Your record is part of the file," Victoria said. "All of it, Mashatan." The board went into closed session at 10:47. Ethan and Victoria were asked to wait outside. They sat in the hallway on a pair of chairs that were slightly too formal for sitting in a hallway, the kind that looked like they'd been placed for exactly this purpose years ago, and nobody had thought to replace them. Victoria sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the opposite wall. Ethan sat beside her and thought about the boardroom, about Marsh, who was careful and experienced and had clearly been doing the math throughout the presentation, about Colton, who had 3 years of loyalty to Damien's version of this company and would need to be moved by the weight of evidence rather than anything else, about the 4 members who'd asked precise, specific questions during his presentation, the kind of questions that meant they were taking the findings seriously and stress testing them rather than dismissing them. "How do you think it went?" Victoria asked. She was asking honestly, not fishing for reassurance. "Marsh is the one to watch. He's going to decide how the room lands." Ethan looked at the closed door. He's been around long enough to recognize the difference between someone defending themselves and someone managing a narrative. "Damien is very good at the second thing." "He is. But so are you." She glanced at him sideways. "You didn't perform in there," he said. "That matters. People can tell." She looked back at the wall. "My hands were shaking the whole time." "I know. You kept them in your lap." Another sideways look. "You noticed that." "I notice things. It's what I do." She was quiet for a moment. When Colton said you had a personal interest in the outcome, you didn't react. I had a personal interest in the outcome. It was true. It was meant to diminish the evidence. I know what it was meant to do. He shrugged slightly. But getting upset about it doesn't make the parts say something different. The evidence is the evidence. I did my job. That's all I can control in there. She considered that. That's a very disciplined way to think. It's a mechanic's way to think. You figure out what you can control, and you control it correctly, and you let the rest of the system do what it's going to do. And if the system fails, then you go back to the beginning and look for what you missed. He paused. But I didn't miss anything. She almost smiled. No, she said. You didn't. They sat in silence for a while. The hallway was quiet except for the distant office sounds of a building going about its business, unaware of what was happening 15 floors up. What happens if they don't move on it? She said. If Colton and the other two hold the room and the board decides to table it pending review? It was a real question, and she deserved a real answer. Then you take it external, regulatory filing. The safety finding alone requires disclosure under industry standards. That's not optional, regardless of what the board decides. The financial misconduct is a separate track. He paused. You don't need the board to do the right thing. The board doing the right thing is the preferred path. It's not the only path. She nodded slowly. You knew that before you asked, he said. I wanted to hear you say it. Why? She was quiet for a second. Because I've been the only person in the room with this for 2 weeks, and I needed to hear someone say it out loud who wasn't me. He understood that. He thought about his kitchen table, the paper with 2 weeks and tool marks, all those mornings he'd sat alone with information he couldn't share with anyone except a 13-year-old who knew the shape of things without the details. Being the only person holding something heavy made the thing heavier. That was just physics. It's the right call, he said. All of it. The postponement, presenting to the board, all of it. Even if it cost the Hartwell deal. Especially then. She looked at him. You believe that? I do. He said it simply. Because the alternative was a person in a car at minute 13, and everything after that, the lawsuits, the regulatory action, the destruction of this company's reputation, the harm to every person who works here, all of that starts with the moment when the choice was made to say nothing. He looked at the closed door. You stopped that. That's worth the $300 million. Tell that to the 62 families whose incomes depend on this company running. I am. He met her eyes. Because if you'd stayed silent, it wouldn't just be $300 million at risk. It would be the whole company, maybe more. The door opened. Gerald Marsh stood in the doorway. He had his jacket on, which meant the session was concluded. His expression was the careful neutral of someone about to deliver a verdict who had been doing this long enough to understand that the delivery mattered. Ms. Sterling, he said, Mr. Cross, please come back in. The board voted 7-3 to immediately suspend Damian Ashford from all operational duties pending formal investigation. The 3 dissenting votes were Colton and 2 others, and Ethan watched them carefully as Marsh read the outcome. They had the particular stillness of people recalculating, not the combative energy of people intending to fight. They'd been outvoted and they knew what the evidence said and they were adjusting to a new reality. That was manageable. Damian received the decision without visible expression, which was the most unsettling version of how a person could receive it. He gathered his legal pad and the board packet, straightened them against the table in a precise rectangle, and stood. I'll be engaging outside counsel, he said. That's your right, Victoria said. He looked at her across the table. Whatever was in that look, and it wasn't quite anger, it was something more complicated than anger. The look of someone who had built a plan over 18 months and was now watching it disassemble in real time. He controlled it within 2 seconds. He looked at Ethan. Ethan held the look steadily, not aggressively. He'd spent his career being looked at by people who thought his presence was incidental. He'd gotten comfortable with the look. Damian said nothing to him. He walked out. The room exhaled. Marsh spoke first because Marsh understood his function. The Hartwell situation. Victoria, you said you'd call James Hartwell directly. This afternoon, she said. What's your approach? She took a breath. Complete transparency. I'm going to tell him what we found, what we've done about it, and what we're putting in place going forward. I'm not going to minimize it or frame it as a systems issue. I'm going to say that we had a deliberate internal breach that we detected, documented, and acted on, and I'm going to let him decide how to proceed based on the full picture. Marsh looked at her for a moment. That's a significant risk. I know. Hartwell could walk. He could. She didn't look away. But if he stays knowing who we actually are, which is worth more than a deal built on an edited version of this story. Marsh held her gaze for a long few seconds. Then he nodded. A small, decided nod, the kind that didn't need any more words attached to it. The call with James Hartwell happened at 2:15 in the afternoon from Victoria's office, with the door closed. Ethan was in Bay 7, reinstalling the correct component in the prototype, the verified original part, sourced directly from Kenworth Technical Systems through a new procurement channel that went through him personally because someone had to, and it might as well be him. He was torquing the final fastener when his phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. He's staying. Revised timeline. He said, and I am quoting directly, I've done business with people who hide their problems and people who fix them. I prefer the second kind. Ethan read the message twice. He set his phone down on the workbench. He finished torquing the fastener. He ran the initial diagnostic sequence. Pressure readings normal. Temperature within spec. The component doing what the component was supposed to do, reliably. The way things should work when nobody's interfering with them. He wrote down the readings. He signed the service record. He filed it in the system and backed it up to his personal device. He was cleaning his tools when Claire appeared at the bay entrance. Miss Sterling would like to see you upstairs when you have a moment, Claire said. Give me 10 minutes. He put the tools away in the right order. He wiped down the workbench. He pulled the fitted cover back over the prototype, straightened it so the logo sat centered, the way it was supposed to. He thought about the morning he'd put his badge on the supervisor's station and walked out. The version of him that had crossed that parking lot and sat in his truck and called his daughter. The version that hadn't known what was coming, hadn't known the scope of what had been buried, or how far the roots of it went, or how much of the last 9 years of his working life had been conducted inside an institution that was being quietly hollowed from a specific direction. He knew now, and the knowing was its own kind of weight, separate from anything that came next. He took the elevator to the 15th floor. Victoria's office had the afternoon light coming through the angled blinds in long bars across the floor. She was at her desk, jacket off now, which was as close to unwound as he'd seen her. She had a glass of water in front of her that she'd apparently been forgetting to drink. She looked like someone who'd been running on cortisol for 2 weeks and had just discovered the cortisol was no longer strictly necessary. Hartwell, he said. Hartwell, she confirmed. Revised timeline. New demonstration date. He wants third-party safety verification as part of the partnership agreement going forward. His suggestion, which I agreed to immediately. She paused. He also said he'd been hearing things in industry channels about our safety culture. I told him those things had been deliberately seeded. He was not surprised. Someone had gotten to him. Someone had started to. Not far enough to move him, but enough that he had questions. She looked at Ethan. If the demonstration had gone forward as planned, if we'd had the accident and then it came out that there were prior industry rumors, it would have looked like we'd known and proceeded anyway. The narrative was already being built. Ethan thought about his conversation with Daniel Park, the channel that Park had become less confident about. He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, so Damien was feeding the story to our competitor's network at the same time as preparing the vehicle. Multiple simultaneous tracks, Ethan said. The sabotage creates the incident. The industry rumors create the context that makes it look systemic rather than isolated. The board presentation in the aftermath positions him as the stability option. He paused. It's comprehensive. I'll give him that. Don't, she said, with a sharpness that surprised him. He looked at her. Don't give him that, she said again, quieter. He put a defective component in a car someone was going to drive. He tampered with my father's car. He erased your records and had you fired. There's nothing to admire in the comprehensiveness of that. He took that. She was right. He'd been doing the mechanical thing, analyzing the system for how it worked, and had momentarily lost the human dimension. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." She shook her head slightly, not at him, more at the whole shape of it. "Legal has been contacted. They're coordinating with the regulatory authority on the safety disclosure. The fraud investigation will be a separate track through the DA's office. That referral goes out Monday." She rubbed her eyes briefly, which was the most unguarded gesture he'd seen from her. "It's going to be months of this." "Yes." "And the company is going to be in the press." "Yes." "And people on the floor are going to be unsettled because their COO was just suspended and the story is going to leak." "It'll leak by Monday," he said. "Probably Sunday." She looked at her hands. "I need to talk to the workforce before they read it somewhere else. Full floor meeting, Monday morning." "Good idea." "I've never done a full floor meeting." "Your father did them twice a year. I was there for several of them." He paused. He stood in the middle of the floor, not on a platform. He talked about what was real. People respected that. She absorbed that. He never talked about his personal life in those meetings. No, but people knew it anyway, somehow. He looked at her. "It's like that when you're genuine. People construct the full picture from the parts they see." She was quiet. "You did the right thing today," he said, "in the boardroom and with Hartwell. The right thing and the hard thing at the same time, which is the worst combination, but you did both." She looked at him with that direct, undecorated look she had when she wasn't performing anything. "I almost didn't, but you did. The margin was smaller than anyone will ever know." He understood that. The private math of a decision, how close the numbers ran before they landed one way or the other. "That's how it always is," he said. "Nobody sees the margin. They only see the call." She picked up the glass of water and finally drank some of it. "I want to talk about your position," she said. "Formally. The consulting agreement runs for another 3 weeks. After that, let's get through Monday first," he said. "Ethan, Monday," he said again. "Floor meeting, workforce addressed, story in the open. Then we talk about what comes next." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. He stood to leave. He was almost at the door when she said, "The Ferrari." He turned. "I want to take it to be fully restored, properly. Not just the safety fixes, the whole car, the way my father kept it." She paused. "I'd like you to oversee it, when this is over." He thought about the car as he'd found it, the condition of it under the hood, beyond the damage, the way Richard Sterling had maintained everything that wasn't what someone had touched, the genuine care underneath the harm. "I can do that," he said. "Thank you." She said it simply, not like a CEO to a contractor, not like a boss to an employee, just one person to another. He walked out. The elevator took him back down to the ground floor, back to the smell of metal and hydraulic fluid and the particular ambient noise of a production floor in the mid-afternoon. He walked through the main space toward the exit, and people nodded or said his name or looked up from what they were doing and then back down. 20-some technicians going about their day, doing work that mattered in a building that was, by some uncomfortable margin, still standing. He pushed through the main door into the afternoon. His truck was in the lot. He had to pick Sophie up at 5. She had a thing after school, some project presentation, and she'd texted him 3 times about it that morning in the particular way she texted when she needed him to actually be there and not just say he'd be there. He had time. He sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the building. He'd spent 9 years inside it, more or less, and in the past month it had revealed dimensions he hadn't known it had, the capability for genuine institutional failure, the way trust became a tool in the wrong hands, the specific weight of knowing something nobody wanted known. He'd carried that weight for 2 weeks without dropping it. His phone buzzed. Sophie. "You're picking me up, right?" He typed back, "Yes, I'll be there." A second passed. Did everything work out? He looked at the building one more time, at the steel and glass facade in the late afternoon light, ordinary and large and still standing. He typed, "Yeah, it worked out." 3 dots appeared, then, "Told you." He put the phone in his pocket and started the truck. The story leaked on Sunday, as Ethan had predicted. It appeared first in an industry trade publication, a careful, sourced piece that managed to convey the essential architecture of the situation without getting the details entirely right, the way early reporting usually works. By Sunday evening, it had been picked up by 2 regional business outlets. By Monday morning, when Ethan pulled into the Velocity Dynamics parking lot at 7:15, there were 2 media vehicles idling near the main entrance and a small cluster of employees standing near the side door in the cold, talking in the low, urgent way of people processing information they'd received from a news alert rather than from their employer. Victoria had seen it coming. She'd called him Saturday afternoon to confirm the floor meeting was still on for Monday, 8 a.m., and her voice had the steady quality of someone who had accepted that a thing was happening and had moved past the part where you wished it wasn't. Any of it wrong? He'd asked. Some details. The broad shape is accurate. Then it's manageable. I know. A pause. Sophie has her project presentation result today. He'd been slightly startled. Not that she remembered, but that she'd asked. She does. How do you think she did? She was confident about it, which either means she did well or she's constitutionally incapable of showing doubt, which is also possible. He'd paused. She gets that from her mother, actually, the confidence. I contributed the stubbornness. Victoria had made a sound that was almost a laugh. Those aren't the worst things to inherit. No, he'd said. They're not. He'd thought about that conversation on Sunday evening while Sophie was telling him, with characteristic brevity, that she'd gotten the highest mark in her class on the presentation. She'd said it the way she said most good things, factually, without performing it, folding the information into the conversation rather than leading with it. He'd made a dinner that was slightly nicer than usual to celebrate, and she'd noticed, and neither of them had made a production of it. Now it was Monday morning, and the floor meeting was in 45 minutes, and Ethan walked through the main entrance with his contractor badge and his diagnostic kit and the quiet purpose of someone who knew what the day held. The floor was at partial capacity. The morning shift had come in, the second shift wasn't due yet, but word had spread and there were more people present than scheduled, which was its own kind of statement. People had come in early to be in the room. He recognized that for what it was. He set his kit at the workbench that had been assigned to him in Bay 7. He'd stopped thinking of his old bench as his, which was a small internal adjustment he'd made without ceremony, and he checked the prototype's status. Everything exactly as he'd left it Friday afternoon. He'd had Claire log a full security check on the bay over the weekend, nothing touched, chain of custody clean. At 7:50, people started moving toward the center of the floor. By 7:58, the main production floor had more people in it than Ethan had seen assembled there since the company's anniversary event 3 years ago. They stood in clusters, some of them still in their jackets, coffee cups in hand, the particular arrangement of people who are waiting for something they're not entirely sure about but have decided to show up for anyway. Victoria came down the main staircase at 8 exactly. She was in the charcoal blazer. She walked through the floor to the center of it, not to the supervisor's station, not to an elevated position, just to the open space in the middle where the floor spread out in every direction and everyone could see her without anything between them. She stood there and she looked at the room, not performing the looking, just actually doing it, taking in the faces around her. Then she talked. She told them what had happened. Not all of it. Not the legal specifics, not the financial thread in its full complexity, but the shape of it, honestly, in the language of a person talking to other people rather than a CEO addressing a workforce. She told them that their COO had been using his access to compromise vehicles and records, that this had been discovered, documented, and reported, and that Damian Ashford had been suspended pending investigation. She told them that the Hartwell partnership was delayed, but not lost. She told them that the prototype was safe and the demonstration would happen when it was ready. She told them about Ethan. Most of you know this man, she said, and she said his name and she said what he'd done. So not what she'd done, not what the investigation had uncovered, but specifically what Ethan Cross had done on the night he'd found the problem, and then again in the weeks that followed. She told them he'd been fired on the worst possible morning for the worst possible reason, which was that someone had made sure his records would look wrong, and she stood in front of 60-some technicians and admitted that she had acted without hearing him. I fired him without asking a full question, she said. That was my failure, not his. And I want to say that in this room, in front of all of you, because it matters that I say it here, and not just in a private conversation or a legal document. The floor was quiet. Ethan was standing near the east wall, his old wall, near his old bench, and he was looking at his shoes for part of this, which he couldn't entirely help. There was something deeply uncomfortable about being publicly addressed in a room where you've spent 9 years being functionally invisible in the way that competent people become invisible. He felt it in his chest, not painfully, just present. He heard Marcus, who was standing 2 people to his left, exhale slowly. He heard someone at the back of the floor start clapping, and then it moved through the room. Not thunderous, not performed, just the genuine sound of people who'd needed to hear something and had heard it. He looked up when it started. He didn't know what to do with his face, so he just let it do what it did, which probably wasn't anything particularly dignified. Victoria looked at him across the floor. He gave her a single nod. She nodded back. The weeks that followed were not clean. They were not the smooth resolution that institutional crises look like in retrospect. They were the messy, daily, grinding work of an organization repairing itself one piece at a time. The regulatory disclosure went through as required, generating a formal review that took 6 weeks and resulted in a compliance order that was uncomfortable but survivable. The fraud referral to the DA's office initiated an investigation that would, Ethan knew, take months and potentially longer before arriving at any formal conclusion. Damian Ashford engaged 2 attorneys and issued a statement through them that was careful and denied everything, which was expected and didn't change what the evidence said. 3 board members, Colton and the 2 who'd voted with him, resigned quietly over the following month. The board began a search for replacements with a new mandate, independent oversight of safety protocols. That part had been Victoria's condition, non-negotiable, included in the same conversation where she'd agreed to the Hartwell revised timeline. The Hartwell Partnership Review happened 8 weeks after the board meeting, on a Tuesday in early spring. The prototype demonstration ran 22 minutes on a closed track. The drive control module performed within spec for every second of those 22 minutes. James Hartwell, who turned out to be a 60-year-old man with a dry sense of humor and an apparently genuine interest in mechanical engineering, watched from the observation area and then asked to see the engine bay, which Ethan showed him personally. "This is the vehicle they tampered with?" Hartwell asked, standing beside the chassis. "The component has been replaced and independently verified," Ethan said. Hartwell looked at the engine bay for a moment. "My father was a machinist," he said. "He used to say you could tell everything about a person by how they treated a machine when it wasn't working right." He closed the hood. "I think I understand what I need to understand." The revised partnership agreement was signed 2 weeks later. The terms were slightly different from the original. A phased investment structure with independent safety audits built into each phase, which Hartwell had proposed and Victoria had accepted without negotiation. The final number was $280 million rather than $300, and the $20 million difference was the cost of honesty, which Ethan thought was actually a reasonable price. Victoria told him the number in the parking lot after the signing, standing by her car, still holding the folder from the ceremony. She said it matter-of-factly. "$280, he said. "$280, she confirmed. "You're okay with that?" She looked at him with the expression she had when she thought a question was underestimating her. "I'm okay with that." He nodded. "Good." Bet. His employment status was formalized in the 3rd week of the 2nd month. It had gone through the board as required. Personnel decisions above a certain compensation level required board approval, which Ethan had not known until Victoria explained it, which made him feel briefly like he'd been living inside a system he'd never fully understood. The board voted unanimously. Gerald Marsh called Victoria to tell her, which she relayed to Ethan in a text that said simply, "It's done. Official title is Director of Technical Integrity. Salary in the offer letter. Let me know." He read the offer letter at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, same table where he'd looked at the empty overtime record 6 weeks earlier, same window with the same kitchen light. The salary was significantly higher than what he'd been making as a senior technician, which should not have surprised him, but did, slightly. He sat with the number for a moment, doing the math that had been his constant companion for years. Mortgage, utilities, Sophie's things, the truck, the ongoing list of costs that a person accumulates in the process of keeping their life running. The math worked. It worked with room left over. He called Daniel Park at Meridian Auto Group. Mr. Cross, Park said, slightly warily. I wanted to call and let you know I've accepted a position at Velocity Dynamics, Ethan said, and to thank you for the conversation we had a while back. You were straightforward with me about how you'd heard my name, and I appreciated that. A pause. I heard the story. How things went. Yeah. Congratulations is probably the right word. Probably, Ethan agreed. Take care, Mr. Park. He hung up and signed the offer letter and sent it back before he could think about it more than it needed to be thought about. Sophie was in her room when he knocked on the door frame. She was on her stomach on the bed with a book, one of the automotive repair manuals she'd borrowed years ago, which he'd stopped trying to reclaim. She looked up. I signed the offer letter, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat up. Director of Technical Integrity? Yeah. That's a real title? Apparently. She looked at him with the evaluating expression she'd inherited from some combination of her parents and her own 13 years of watching him navigate things. Then she said, Does that mean I can get new cleats? He stared at her. She grinned. The full version, the one that she rationed and he valued accordingly. I'm kidding, mostly. You can get the cleats, he said. She fell back onto the bed and opened the manual. Knew it. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, just looking at her. His kid, his impossible kid, the person who'd packed him a sandwich and told him she knew him, and that was enough. Then he turned off the hallway light and let her read. The work of rebuilding the institutional structures around safety and oversight was, as it turned out, the most absorbing thing Ethan had done in his professional life. It was different from diagnostic work, less solitary, more dependent on other people doing their parts correctly, and it required a kind of patience that was not natural to him, but that he developed imperfectly over months. He created a technical review protocol that ran independent of the management chain for safety-critical findings. He lobbied Victoria, and then the board, and eventually got approval for a standing safety committee with rotating membership drawn from the floor technicians, people who actually touched the vehicles, who knew what deviated from standard because they'd seen standard for years. He made the overtime logging system redundant, with personal export functionality built into the interface, because a system that could be erased was not a system that could be trusted. He mentored Marcus, who turned out to have a genuinely good mechanical intuition under the inexperience. He was patient with it mostly. He told Marcus once that the most important thing a technician could develop was the willingness to say, I don't know before reaching for an answer, because the wrong answer delivered confidently cost more than the honest uncertainty that prompted another look. Marcus had written that down, which had made Ethan feel strange and slightly old. He thought, during this period, about what it meant to work inside an institution, about the difference between a place that used its people and a place that was made of them. He'd spent 9 years at Velocity Dynamics without fully articulating that distinction, and the distinction had turned out to matter enormously. The institution had nearly been hollowed from the inside by someone who understood how to use it while treating its people as furniture. What had stopped it wasn't the systems. The systems had been compromised. What had stopped it was a person who'd stayed in a bay all night because walking away from a problem felt worse than the alternative. He thought about that sometimes when he was tired, which was often, because the new role was demanding and the hours were longer than the old role in a different way. More decisions, more responsibility for other people's work, more moments where the thing that needed doing was talking to a person rather than fixing a part. He was better at the latter than the former, and he knew it, and he worked on it the way he worked on anything he wasn't naturally good at, with methodical, unglamorous repetition. One Tuesday afternoon, he was in the middle of a review session with the safety committee when his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. He glanced at it under the table. Are you free after 5? He typed back, Depends. What for? The Ferrari. It's ready. He looked at the message for a moment, then put the phone away and brought his attention back to the meeting. Go. He'd overseen the Ferrari's restoration personally, which had taken 11 weeks from start to finish, longer than it should have, because he'd been doing it around everything else, finding hours on weekends and late afternoons when the bay was quiet and the work could have the attention it deserved. The car had been in good condition underneath what Damien had done to it. Richard Sterling had maintained it with genuine care, The engine was clean, the body panels were original, the interior was worn in the particular way of something that had been used lovingly rather than neglected. A worn steering wheel meant someone's hands had been on it. Worn seat leather meant someone had sat there, had gone somewhere, had come back. He'd replaced what needed replacing and restored what could be restored. He'd had the body professionally detailed, but had done the engine work himself because it was his sign-off that was going on the service record, and he was the one who needed to be able to stand behind every fastener. He'd taken longer on some parts than a professional restoration shop would have, not because he was slow, but because he was, in certain moments, doing something that felt less like mechanical work and more like an act of care for a person who was no longer present to receive it. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. He just did the work correctly. When it was done, he'd driven it once, alone, in the parking structure after hours, a single slow circuit to confirm everything responded the way it should. The engine was quiet and smooth, and the steering was precise. It was a car that had been loved and then harmed and then returned as close as possible to what it had been. He'd covered it and waited. Now it was a Tuesday in late spring, 6 months, roughly, since the morning he'd walked in 47 minutes late and had his badge taken, and he was standing in the private bay when Victoria came in. She was in jeans and a jacket, which he'd never seen on her before. She looked like a different version of herself, or possibly like the version underneath the version he usually saw. She stopped when she saw the car, still covered, and then looked at him. "How is it?" she said. "Come see." He pulled the cover off. The cherry red paint caught the bay lights the way it always had. Not flashy, just confident. The particular quality of a car that knew exactly what it was. Victoria stood very still. He watched her face. He'd learned to read it over the past 6 months, the controlled expressions and the real ones underneath. And what was on it now was something he'd only seen glimpses of before. The edges of grief and something warmer than grief. The complicated territory of loving someone who was gone and then being confronted with an object that held them. "He bought it the year I was born," she said. "I know. He used to let me sit in the driver's seat when I was small. I couldn't reach the pedals." She stepped forward slowly, reached out, touched the hood with her palm. He'd let me hold the steering wheel and make the engine sounds. He said I was a natural. A pause. He said I was a natural at everything. I never knew if he believed it or if it was just what fathers said. "I don't know what fathers are supposed to say," Ethan said. "I just try to say what's true." She looked at him. "What do you tell Sophie?" "That she's good at the things she's actually good at, and that the things she's not good at yet are just things she hasn't worked on long enough. That's more honest than what most parents say. She'd see through anything else." He leaned against the workbench. "And she deserves the real version. Kids know when you're managing them instead of talking to them. They just don't always have the words for what that feels like." Victoria was quiet, her hand still resting on the hood. "My father managed me," she said. "Not unkindly. He had a vision of what I was going to be, and he was very committed to it. It was mostly right, but the parts where it wasn't right, I spent years apologizing for internally." She paused. "After he died, I spent 6 months trying to be exactly what he'd planned. And then I realized I wasn't sure which parts of me were what he'd built and which parts were actually mine. And I think the parts that matter most are mine." She said it carefully, like someone saying a thing for the first time that they've thought about for a long time. "The things I did in the boardroom, the call with Hartwell, those weren't what he would have done, necessarily. He was more strategic about risk. He would have managed the situation. I just told the truth and let it land." "That worked out," Ethan said. "It did." She almost smiled. "It might not have." "No, it might not have." He looked at the Ferrari. "That's the thing about the truth. It's not a guarantee. It's just the only version that holds up when you look at it from every angle." She turned from the car and looked at him directly. "I owe you an apology. You made one, on the floor. I owe you a real one, not a public one." She held his gaze. "I had your record in front of me, 9 years of it. I knew your name because your supervisor had mentioned you specifically in a performance review I'd read 3 months earlier. He called you the best diagnostic technician on the floor, and also, and I quote, impossible to manage because he's right more often than I am. I knew who you were, and I still fired you in front of 60 people without asking you a full question. She paused. I was under pressure, and I made a fast decision, and I told myself it was decisive leadership. It was a mistake that I dressed up as a decision. He let that sit for a moment. I appreciate that, he said. Is that all? What else would there be? She looked at him. Most people would want more. More acknowledgement, more, I don't know, weight to it. I've thought about it, he said honestly. The morning, the parking lot afterward, the 11 minutes I sat in my truck. He paused. What I kept coming back to was that I would have done the same thing. If I'd been in your position, hadn't slept, had $300 million in a conference room upstairs, and a senior tech walked in 47 minutes late, I don't know that I would have asked the full question either. She looked slightly startled. That doesn't mean it was right, he said. It means it was human. People make fast decisions from incomplete information under pressure. The question isn't whether you made a mistake. The question is what you did when you understood what the mistake cost. He paused. You put the scorched component on your desk, and you sat with what it meant. That night, before you knew anything about Damien or the records or any of it, you sat with what that component meant. He looked at her. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a long moment. My father would have liked you, she said. He'd have made it difficult to see it. He didn't like people who were right more often than he was, either. But he would have liked you. I liked him, Ethan said. From a distance. He was fair. He was difficult. Fair and difficult aren't mutually exclusive. She laughed at that. A real laugh, brief and sudden, the kind that surprised her. He'd heard it a handful of times now, and it still felt like catching a glimpse of something that didn't usually show itself. Drive it, he said. She looked at the car. Now? The structure's empty. I've already taken it around once to confirm the systems. It's ready. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out the key. Take it around. She looked at the key for a moment, then she took it. She got in slowly, the way people get into things they've been waiting to do. Carefully, aware of the moment. He heard the engine turn over, heard it settle into its idle, the quiet and steady sound of something running correctly. The door closed. He stepped to the side of the bay. The Ferrari moved forward, out through the bay door, into the structure's lower lane. He heard it make one circuit, unhurried, not pushed, just moving. Then it came back and pulled in and stopped, and the engine idled for a few seconds, and then was quiet. She sat in the car for a moment before she got out. When she did, her face had the look of someone who has just put something down that they've been carrying for a long time without fully knowing it. She came around to the front of the car where he was standing, and she looked at the hood, at the clean, correct, functioning vehicle that had been returned as close as possible to what it was. He took me for a drive in this car the week before he died, she said. I didn't know it was the week before he died. We just went for a drive. He didn't say much. He played the radio and he drove, and at one point he said, You're going to be fine, you know. Just like that. Out of nowhere. She paused. I didn't know what to say, so I said, I know, Dad. And he said, I mean it. You're going to be fine. And then we drove home. She looked up from the hood. I've been trying to figure out what he meant for 14 months. Ethan looked at her. I think he meant it the way it sounded. Simple as that? He saw something in you that he wanted to make sure you knew he saw, and he didn't know how to say it any other way than directly. He paused. Sometimes people are just telling you the truth. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she put the key back in her jacket pocket. Thank you, she said, for this. She meant the car, and also more than the car, and he understood both. It's good work, he said. The restoration, the car deserved it. So did you, she said. The job, the title, the thing on the floor today. I know, he said. Not arrogantly, just accurately, the way he'd have confirmed a correct pressure reading. He'd done the work. The work deserved the acknowledgement. Those two things were allowed to be true simultaneously. So, it was after 6 when he left the building, later than he'd planned. He texted Sophie to say he was on his way, and she responded with a single thumbs up, which was her shorthand for understood and also for stop texting while you're driving, which he wasn't yet but would be shortly. He sat in his truck for a moment before starting the engine. 6 months. He'd been fired on the most important morning in the company's history, and 6 months later he had a title and a restored car and a safety committee that met every other Thursday, and a 13-year-old who was growing into someone with opinions about torque specifications. The arc of it was, objectively, something you could look at and call good. He knew that. He sat with it. What he kept thinking about, in the private internal space of a person driving home at the end of a day, was the question of what it cost, not the financial math. That had resolved itself. The other cost. The cost of being someone who didn't walk away from a problem he could see clearly. The overtime records and the 7 hours in the bay and the long weeks of quiet documentation and the boardroom and all of it. It had cost him sleep and stability and the comfortable version of his life. And it had also produced something he couldn't quite name, but that was present whenever he walked through that building's main entrance. He thought about what he'd want Sophie to know from it, if he ever found a way to tell her the full story. Not the mechanics of what happened. She'd figure those out. She was going to be someone who figured things out, but the thing underneath the mechanics. He thought, sometimes the right thing is expensive, and you don't know in advance how expensive. And that's the honest condition of doing it. You don't get to know the outcome before you choose. You only get to know what you can see clearly, and whether you can live with the version of yourself that looks away. He thought, Sophie already knows that. She knew it when she packed the sandwich. She knew it when she said, I know you, that's enough. He thought, she got that from somewhere, and he was fairly sure she got it from the only place she could have. From watching him, over 13 years of hard and ordinary mornings, make the same call without announcing it. That mattered to him more than the title, more than the partnership, more than whatever came next. He started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot. The spring evening was doing what spring evenings do. Long light, mild air, the particular color of a sky that hasn't decided whether to be day or night yet. The city moved around him. He drove through it, thinking about dinner, thinking about cleats, thinking about the sound of a Ferrari engine idling in a quiet bay, thinking about the shape of what a person leaves behind when they refuse to leave quietly. It occurred to him, somewhere on the familiar route home, that he'd spent most of his adult life being someone who solved things that were broken. Engines, systems, components that weren't doing what they were designed to do. It was what he was good at and what he understood and what he'd built his professional life around. The past 6 months had not been different from that, really. Just a larger scale. Just the same principle applied to a problem that had more people in it, more moving parts, more riding on the diagnosis. You find the fault. You document it correctly, you fix it, and you sign your name to the fix. That's all it was. He turned onto Caldwell Street. The kitchen light was on, visible through the window. The same light that had been on in the same window for 6 years, which was either ordinary or something better than ordinary, depending on how you looked at it. Sophie was in there doing whatever Sophie was doing. Homework, or the manual she'd borrowed, or the particular teenage business of being 13 and growing into someone. She'd ask him about his day. He'd tell her about the car. She'd ask good questions, the kind that required honest answers. He parked in the driveway and sat for just a moment, listening to the engine tick down. The street was quiet. The neighborhood was doing its evening thing. Everything was exactly as large and as small as it actually was. No larger, no smaller. A man in a driveway after a long day about to go inside. He got out of the truck and went in. The door closed behind him. The kitchen smelled like something Sophie had heated up, probably from the previous night's leftovers, and she was at the table with the automotive manual open and her headphones half off in the way she wore them when she wanted to be available for conversation while technically still listening to something. She looked up, read his face the way she always did. "Good day?" she said. He pulled out his chair and sat across from her. "Yeah," he said. "Good day." She nodded once, satisfied, and looked back at the manual. He looked at the page she was on. Torque specifications for a suspension rebuild, annotated in her handwriting in the margin. She'd written a question in pencil. Why different spec for left versus right? "Because the left side bolt runs counterthread," he said. "Prevents loosening from the rotation direction." She looked up. "I didn't ask." You wrote it on the page. She looked at the page, then back at him. That's actually helpful. You're welcome. She turned the page and kept reading. He sat across from her in the kitchen light, not saying anything else, letting the evening settle around them the way evenings do when the hard part is over and what's left is the ordinary life that the hard part was for. That's the thing nobody tells you about doing the right thing when it costs you. It doesn't arrive with music. It doesn't announce itself. It ends up looking like a Tuesday evening in a small house on a street where nothing particular is happening, with your kid reading a manual she borrowed without asking, and a dinner that's probably leftovers, and the comfortable, unspectacular feeling of a person who can look at every decision they've made and not need to look away. That's what it looks like. That's what it's worth.